In today's video, we're looking at the Korean War, which started in 1950. There are 4 essential questions that you need to be able to answer by the end of this video. The first, what are the causes of the war? The second, why did the US and UN get involved? The third, what happened? And the fourth, what was the impact? Throughout the video, you should be looking for the answers to these questions, and at the end of the video, you should be able to answer them in detail. Try to test yourself. To start off with, we need to look at what Korea was like leading up to the war in 1950. Until 1945 and the end of World War II, Korea was ruled by Japan. The Japanese regime was quite brutal, and most Koreans look back on that time in sadness and anger. It was not a good time for the country. A relic of this regime is that many older Koreans you might meet actually speak Japanese due to the fact that they were forced to learn it in school. At the end of World War II, Korea was liberated from Japanese rule. However, different parts of the country were liberated by different armies. The North was liberated by Soviet troops, so they became an ally of Russia and developed a communist dictatorship headed by Kim Il-sung, the man with a very toothy grin. The South, on the other hand, was liberated by American troops. It was not very democratic, but, as an American ally, it hated communism. The South was headed by Syngman Rhee. North Korea and South Korea were divided along the 38th parallel. So you can see the 38th parallel on the map, and in the north we have North Korea with the capital city of Pyongyang, while in the south there is South Korea with its capital city of Seoul. Now that you understand why the country was divided into North and South after World War II, let's look at the spark that started the war. Basically, Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, wanted to unite North and South under communist rule. In 1945, he visited Stalin as well as Mao, and he convinced them to let him invade South Korea. Stalin only gave Sung permission because Stalin thought that the USA wouldn't get involved in this war. Then, in 1950, Syngman Rhee, the South Korean leader, boasted that he was going to attack North Korea. And this, as a result, gave North Korea an excuse to invade the South. So, on June 25, 1950, North Korea sent 90,000 North Korean People's Army, or NKPA, troops into South Korea, and they were very, very successful. Most of the North Korean troops had fought in the Chinese Revolution only a year before, and they were so successful that they pushed South Korea all the way back to that little green area around Busan. They basically controlled almost the entirety of the Korean peninsula. So, that is the first phase of the Korean War. And the USA freaked out. President Truman was the head of government at this time, and he was really alarmed because in 1918, Russia had turned to communism. In 1949, China had turned to communism. And now it looked as if South Korea was going to fall to communism as well. Truman called this the domino effect. One country falling to communism, then the next, and the next, like dominoes. Truman kind of thought of communism as a sort of disease that was spreading to different countries, and he didn't like it. He didn't like it, and he felt that it was the duty of America to contain the spread of communism in Asia. Contain it, meaning that it could stay in the countries that it was already in, but not let it spread any further. So Truman declared that the Truman Doctrine applied to Asia as well. And, more importantly, I suppose, he asked for UN involvement. Now, at this point, Russia wasn't in the UN, so when the vote was held, Russia didn't have a vote. Had Russia been able to vote, it probably would have tried to stop the UN becoming involved. And also because the USA was one of the biggest funders of the UN eventually agreed to send support. So, by the end of June, the UN sent 300,000 troops led by an American general by the name of Douglas MacArthur. You can see his picture here. It's interesting to note that of those 300,000 troops, 260,000 men were actually American, and the other 40,000 were from 18 different countries, including Britain and Canada. So, when they got involved in the war, we move on to the second phase of the 4 phases of the war. Remember that the first phase was when North Korea pushed South Korea all the way back to Busan. The second phase began when the UN troops landed. There were 2 landings, one in Busan and the other near Incheon, which is right near Seoul. Incheon is where the main South Korean airport is now, near Seoul on the coast. By May 1950, the UN troops had driven the North Korean People's Army back to the 38th parallel and recaptured South Korea. By November 1950, they had actually advanced almost to the Chinese border. So they were really successful. However, because they were so close to China, it alarmed the Chinese. As a result, in October 1950, 200,000 Chinese troops, named the People's Volunteers, armed by Russia and with an intense hatred of America ingrained in them, counterattacked the UN troops. And by December, 500,000 more Chinese troops arrived. And, as you can see from the map, they start invading South Korea and are so successful that they get past Seoul. MacArthur wanted to carry on the war, and he wanted to carry on into invading China. However, Truman said no, it was all right to merely save South Korea. It's important to note that the war was not very popular in the US. By February 1951, the USA sent more troops and bumped up their bombing raids. They were trying to drive the Chinese back, which they did. By March 1951, the final phase of the war was entered as the 38th parallel was reached. Truman told MacArthur to stop at the 38th parallel, but MacArthur criticized the order, and as a result, in April 1951, Truman fired MacArthur. The war continued on for a while, but by 1953, when Eisenhower became President of the United States, an armistice was reached. This armistice was never signed, so technically North Korea and South Korea are still at war, although the fighting has ceased. And finally, we move into the impact of the war. Basically, the Korean War demonstrated that the USA was committed to containing communism around the world. Stalin had thought that the US wouldn't get involved in this war, but they did. And you will see in the future that they get involved in many other wars. The second impact was that the involvement of Russia and China made the USA increase their defense spending by about 400%. And the third thing that happened was that this event changed the nature of Marshall Aid. At first, if you remember, Marshall Aid was used for supporting economic growth. Now it was to be used for defense spending in Western Europe as well. And this led to the rearmament of the Western world. Armies throughout the world got bigger. So you can see that the Korean War, while on the surface might seem to be solely between North and South Korea, was in fact international in scope. The USA and USSR used it as a way to fight each other without actually going into hot war against each other, which is key because superpowers had atomic weapons, and if they had gone to war, the possibility of mutually assured destruction was high. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.